racial preferences have become a depressing feature of our society. And by the way, racial and gender preferences. We see them in college admissions. We see them in job hiring. We see them in federal contracting. And most of this is done in the name of diversity. We need a diverse student body. We need a diverse workforce. We need to have federal contracts that contractors who look like America. So under the pretext of creating diversity, what you have is more eligible people are turned away and less eligible people get the position. They're admitted to a school, a selective school, or they are hired. And all of this runs afoul of our civil rights laws. It runs afoul of the clear language, not just of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is, of course, the kind of the landmark document here, not just of the clear language, the equal protection language of the Constitution, but a whole series of other civil rights laws, some of which, by the way, go back to the 19th century, go back to laws that Republicans enacted in the aftermath of the Civil War. There's, for example, something called the 1886 Civil Rights Act. This is a law that bars or bans contracting on the basis of race. You can't make a contract and say this contract only applies to white people or only applies to black people. That kind of discrimination is forbidden. And this goes all the way back to the 1880s. Now, that law may have been flouted in practice, but with the civil rights laws of the 1960s, 50s and 60s, starting with the Brown decision, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Bill, the idea here of non-discrimination becomes embedded in our law. And yet, the very left that pushed for some of those laws then has now turned around and now promotes discrimination, sort of benign discrimination, as they sometimes call it, on the basis of race. Now, Google has a prestigious fellowship program that it funds, and it looks for participating universities. And there's a whole bunch of universities that are participating in this program. They include Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, MIT, Columbia, Cornell, Duke, Johns Hopkins, University of Pennsylvania, UNC Chapel Hill, Berkeley, New York University. And the way this works is that the universities nominate 4 students annually for a PhD. These are PhD students. And Google gives them $100,000 in a kind of fellowship, which includes mentoring at Google. And of course, Google is looking at the possibility of maybe hiring these people. But here's the key point. If a university chooses to nominate more than 2 students, this is the rule that Google has set up, the 3rd and 4th nominees must self-identify as a woman, Black, African descent, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Indigenous, or a person with a disability. By the way, what does it mean to identify as a person with a disability? Can I identify as a person with a disability? I can throw an epileptic fit every now and then on the podcast if I need to substantiate my identification. Or is it that I merely imaginatively identify as a disabled person? Every now and then I make some wheelchair motions. And then do I qualify for this Google fellowship? Well, the point here is that we might be seeing a violation of law here at 2 separate levels. Google violating the law. How? Well, it's violating the Civil Rights Act of 1886 for starters, because think about it, that's a law that bans contracting on the basis of race. What is Google doing? It's entering into a contract, and arguably an employment contract, because why? It involves mentoring at Google. Students are in a fellowship at Google, but they remain in the PhD program, and then eventually they have the possibility of being hired at Google. So the court is probably going to look at that as Google entering into a contract that imposes reciprocal. There are some obligations on the beneficiary of the fellowship. It's not just a one-sided, I'll give you something in exchange for nothing. But the universities, for their part, could be violating all kinds of rules by engaging in a relationship with Google in which they have essentially are bound by a strict quota system. And the quota system is that if you happen to have two, let's just say white males who have been chosen, you now have to assign the other two to either a woman or someone who identifies as a woman, or a member of one of these ethnic groups. By the way, you see here how racial preferences are driven not just by the Biden administration, not just by university faculty and administrations, but also here by woke corporations like Google. So the pressure to move away from a colorblind system or a merit-based system is coming from multiple directions. If you want to know how our culture has sort of yielded to so much of this woke nonsense, it's because multiple actors in media, actors in entertainment, actors in the corporate sector, in the academic sector, they're all pulling in the same direction. They're establishing networks, sometimes with each other, and so what you have is ultimately the resistance. Even if there's someone who fights back at the university level, they're undermined by somebody at the corporate level. Or somebody in the corporate level says, let's not do this. Then the universities are doing it. The government is pressuring them to do it. So this is how we get a surrender of our cultural institutions to this woke ideology. By the way, corporations that have tried this kind of racial preference have frequently been defeated. They've been defeated by people suing them who say, listen, I was disadvantaged by this rule. A small example is Uber Eats. Uber Eats said, we're not going to charge any delivery fees to black-owned restaurants. Immediately, lawsuit. And Uber Eats goes, well, no, we discontinue the policy. So I would recommend that students at these universities sue Google and sue the university for violating their civil rights. Because if these students are white and they're being passed over in order for the universities to nominate only a woman or only a racial minority, this very likely violates our civil rights laws, and this is one way to bring these universities, as well as Google, back into line with the concept of hiring people based on their capacities, based on their talents, not based, as Martin Luther King reminded us a long time ago, not based on the color of our skin.